Good morning, and thank you for joining us here at the Future Panther Academy. My name is Bonnie Fugiasco. I serve as the Special Events Manager for the Alumni Association at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So I want to welcome back all of you who have been with us for our entire series. This is our 8th week already. Can you believe it? I also want to welcome any new viewers that we have today. You are in store for a great treat today. Our series is called Stars Have Stories, and joining us is Dr. Jean Creighton. She has been our host for the series. She is an astronomer, and she's also the director of the planetarium since 2007 at the University of Wisconsin. So she is with us again today, and her story is called How Do Stars Help Us Tell Stories? So for those of you who are watching live today, you'll see a little chat box on your screen. Feel free to send in any questions to Dr. Jean, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, excuse me, before the end of the program. So if you've missed any of our other programs and you're interested, take a look at our website. We've got all of them listed. There's links where you can watch anytime on demand. So check those out if you've missed any of our previous shows. So with that said, everybody settle in, get comfortable. You're in for a good treat today as Dr. Jean presents How Do Stars Help Us Tell Stories?
Thank you so much, Bonnie, and thanks everyone for being here and sharing this experience with me. I want to transport you to my childhood. I grew up in Greece, as I've said before, and sometimes what we would do is at nighttime, we didn't have electricity in the cottage at summertime. So what we would do was we would look up at the stars and planets if there were any. And my Uncle Leonidas would tell us stories, about the stars, would tell us stories about some of the myths that were associated with the constellations. So today I have the great pleasure of telling you a story that I know from my Greek heritage, from my Greek culture. And it connects to a constellation that we've talked about now many times, and that is the Big Dipper. Its official name is Ursa Major, which means bear. So let me tell you the story of how the bear got to get in the sky. You're seeing here a picture of Arcadia. This is, if you imagine the Peloponnesus is one of the regions of Greece. It's kind of in the middle of the Peloponnese. And this is where Callisto, the nymph, grew up. Her father was Lycaon. And in fact, the mountain in the back where there is called Lycaon, the mountain Lycaon. So she was this beautiful nymph. She was a very accomplished young woman. And her name is Callisto. In English, sometimes people say Callisto. So I'll try and say both the English and the Greek pronunciation just so that you know what it's supposed to sound like. So Callisto was a priestess for the goddess of the hunt, who in Greek is named Artemis. Now, you may know the name Diana because the Romans decided that the Greek pantheon was so cool that they adopted it. They used different words, but they took a lot of the ideas, as often people do when cultures meet. They borrow from each other things that they think are useful or interesting. So Callisto was the priestess for Artemis, and Artemis, as often gods were, demanded full attention. So they wanted your devotion entirely to them. And yet poor Callisto got distracted because the god of all gods, so Zeus himself, thought that Callisto was particularly wonderful and worth knowing. And together they had a baby called Arcas. Can you say Arcas? If this sounds a little familiar, I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance to repeat, did I? Arcas. Right. If this sounds a little familiar, it is tied to the name of a star I've mentioned before, Arcturus. That's a separate story. In any case, Callisto had a baby, and this distraction made Artemis mad. And the goddess changed lovely Callisto into a big, burly bear. Her baby, Arcas, was taken care of by the family, and he grew up to be this wonderful hunter, among other things. People had to hunt for their food at that time. And the bear spent her time wandering the world, trying to find her baby, making sure that her son, in fact, is in good hands, that he grew up to be healthy and competent. So one day, she's sitting by the river, and she notices across the river her son. Her son has grown up, and she rushes toward him. Now, bears look like big lumbering animals, but actually they can outrun a horse for short distances. So she's quick, and she's about to get to him. Now, what would you feel if you're sitting there minding your own business, trying to catch some fish, and you see a big bear rushing toward you? It's probably quite scary. And he takes out his bow and arrow, and he's about to hit her. Now, Zeus sees this thing from above and realizes, oh my goodness, he is about to kill, unbeknownst to him, his own mother. Now, this kind of crime was considered the top of the lot, the absolute worst. And for crimes like this, the Greek myths had the Erinyes, known in English as furies, but I like to say the words, I'm going to say it again, Erinyes. These were vicious creatures that would hunt you to the end of your days to punish you for such an inexcusable crime. Zeus could not let this happen. So he thought fast, and he changed Arcas into a baby bear. So now the two bears could rush through the water and give each other a big bear hug, and all was well. To be sure that the two animals are safe, Zeus took the tail of Callisto, the big bear, the tail of Arcas, the little bear, and he put them in the sky to keep an eye on them. That's how the Greeks explained how these two constellations are always above the horizon so that Zeus can keep an eye on them. It also explains why the two bears have ridiculously long tails, right? Bears don't have tails that look like that, but they got stretched out when Zeus put them up in the sky. And this is the story, according to the ancient Greeks, of how the Big and the Little Dipper, or the Big and the Little Bear, if you will, got into the sky. These are the stories that I'm familiar with, that I grew up with, and even so, an individual story has all kinds of variations. I had a great time. Let me show you my book. I had a great time looking at variations. I have this cool Greek and mythology encyclopedia that I was able to consult, and other books too, to see which version was I going to say. You might have heard variations on this very theme. But in addition to individual stories and same culture having different kind of flavors, variations, of course, different people on the earth, different cultures, had different ways of looking at stars. Not only did they group stars differently, but they also told different stories. It is my pleasure to tell you a story that connects to the beaver stars. This is an Anishinaabe story, and I'm going to read it to you as it was given to me. So I will tell you the story here. Long ago, there was a time when one great beaver was created, much larger than the beavers we have today. In that time, the beaver would build a great lodge wherever the beaver settled. I should point out here that the Anishinaabe culture is alive and well right now. There are over 150 different communities, both in the northern United States and in Canada, and they speak multiple languages. The Anishinaabe people is a great enough civilization culture that, just like the Romance languages, there are variations different ones. So I just wanted to point out the Anishinaabe people are here today. So I'll keep reading my story. So we were at a great lodge wherever the beaver settled. Also, the dams this beaver built would flood vast areas of land. Many times, the Anishinaabe people would have to move and resettle another area because their land would be flooded. Eventually, the Anishinaabe people grew tired of having to always move from areas that provided great hunting, gathering, and other essentials to live their lives. They asked Gemini, the creator, to help them with their problem of always having to deal with the flooding from these dams. One day, the creator sent a thunder being to remove the great beaver. When the thunder being arrived, a great fight began between the thunder being and the great beaver. At one point, the thunder being used its claws to grab the beaver and then began to lift the beaver into the sky. As the beaver squirmed and writhed to gain release from the claws, blood fell onto the land and formed many small pools. From these pools, smaller versions of the beaver began to rise out and are the reason why the beavers of today look as they do. The thunder being carried the great beaver up into the sky, where the beaver was eventually left there as a reminder to the Anishinaabe people about this part of their history. Where the beaver was left is where the constellation Gemini is located, though the old ones referred to it as Amik-Anong, Amik meaning beaver, and Anong is star. So say it with me, Amik-Anong. Yeah, Amik is beaver and Anong is stars. I'd like us now to focus on this picture of Gemini. I think of them as two stick figures, but let's see, where is the beaver here? Imagine that the beaver is face on. So the top two stars are its ears. The middle star is its nose. And those lines that stick out are his whiskers. The body is between the two straight lines, and its tail, its nice flappy tail, is on the left side where those two stars are connected. That would be his tail on the left. So these are the beaver stars, and we are able to see, now we won't be able to see them now. These are, this is a constellation that we can see easily in the early evening during the wintertime and early spring. So far, we have talked about how people look up, they connect stars, they make patterns in the sky, and they connect them to an object for which sometimes they have a story. Now, these stories are different for different cultures, and they change over time. It's not like they're fixed. Sometimes they get changed a little bit over time. The bones of the story, as my theater professor friend says, the bones of the story often remain the same. So I'd like to talk about something that I've learned that I find so interesting. And that is that we find that some themes are the same. So for example, this story that I told you, the Greek story about the bear, is part of a whole family of stories that we see all over the world called the Great Hunt. And we find that there are similar ideas, so that we have a big mammal involved. It's hunted by something in the sky. In our case, it was Artemis the goddess, but it could have been other things that got into the sky. We have a creature who alive got transformed into a constellation, and that this great hunt story is often connected to what we call the Big Dipper. So that tells us that if you look at how the stories changed in different parts of the world and compare it to some of the big migrations over tens of thousands of years, It tells us that these stories were important enough to people. They shared it with their children, their grandchildren, that those stories traveled with people over long periods of time and over large tracts of earth. So, for example, in the story of the cosmic hunt, the animal is not necessarily the same, although there are a lot of bears, right? We see bears in Asia, we see bears in many parts of the current of North America, but not every place had a bear. We see in the Arctic elk or reindeer, because those would be the animals that would be more relevant to their reality, to their everyday existence. We have, for example, in Africa, camels, zebras, even pigs. Notice how in the southwest, we have deer and mountain sheep. And I was particularly interested in I thought it was intriguing that, of course, in South America, people wouldn't have had bears. There's a tapir there, which would be their kind of local animal. And in the Basque region of Spain, which is away from the Mediterranean, they highlighted the ox. So again, that tells us that people connect the stars with the animals that would have been particular in their experience. And I think that tells us something powerful about the need to tell a story that connects stars with our everyday experiences. And with that, I'm, as always, thrilled to hear the kinds of questions that you would like to discuss. So we can't hear Bonnie.
Oh, there we are. Okay, we've got sound now. All right, our first question is from Laura, and she wants to know, why did people connect stars to create the constellations?
Thank you for asking, Lara, because it reminds me to say that for an astronomer in modern astronomy, a constellation is like a patch of sky. It's not a connect the dot at all. It is a way of saying, oh, look at the sky. It's like a map, like the map of the states, and each patch of sky is one constellation. And it gets its name from the pattern that people might have seen in different cultures, right? Now, why do we do this? Why do people see patterns? Our brains are wired to see patterns. That's actually helped us to solve problems, because we say, oh, I see a pattern, I see a reason why this might be. So our brains are very good at seeing patterns, even when the patterns, I could argue, aren't very obvious, right? So we like to see patterns. It helps us remember where those constellations are, where those stars are. And even better, if you can connect a story to the pattern, you're even more equipped to remember where those stars are. Thank you for that great question.
Okay, and our next question comes from Candace. I know there's a lot of mythology and lore with the stars. Are there any stories with the stars that are still relevant today?
You know, Candace, stories are interesting because they connect us to a cultural common language. The need we have to share stories is very strong. So even if the stories are connected to things that are older, right? So in my daily experience, I don't encounter bears very often. I do like the idea that I can bring some of that past to the present. Admittedly, I have an advantage because my Greek heritage, I grew up in Greece. So a lot of it is kind of sitting around, right? So for me, Arcadia is not an exotic place. It is, in fact, where my father grew up. So that helps. But in any case, I think it's wonderful to learn about your own culture and other cultures through cultural stories that people share with stars. Lovely question.
Okay, our next question comes from Zach, and he asks, does every constellation have a story?
Not really, because of the 88 constellations that we have today, some of those constellations are pretty underwhelming is the word that comes to mind. Very faint stars. They wouldn't be, look at me, tell a story about me kind of things. So not all of them have stories. And frankly, there were some constellations that, for example, would not have been visible to everybody on the planet. So those constellations very far south, for example, would certainly not have a Greek equivalent. They would be stories that people would say in Patagonia or in South Africa or in Australia. So that's, I guess, another point, that any constellation would not have been visible from everybody on Earth.
Okay. Our next question is from Stephanie. What stories do the stars tell?
Good question, since that's the title of our whole series. Today, I focused on the stories that are cultural, the stories that tell us something about the needs and interests of different people through the ages. Our series, the rest of it, has talked about what stories, what can we measure, what can we see in the stars that tell us something about the story of the stars themselves. So when we're thinking about stars, how do they grow old? How do they change over time? How hot are they? How much light? How far they are? All of these things we've talked about in some detail in our previous episodes. So you're invited to look at those and see, what stories do stars tell? It turns out the stories they tell are great. Thanks for your question.
Okay, and here's a question from Sydney. Where can I find more about constellations and their stories?
I would advise you to go to the library. There are lots of great books that will have stories, Greek stories, but also other stories around the world. In some cases, you'll see variations of the theme, and that's fine. I can give you, assuming that you don't speak Greek, if you do speak Greek, then this Greek encyclopedia is a great resource. Many of our listeners won't be able to do that. So for Greek myths, I can recommend this book by Robert Graves. It's a classic reference. The book is called Greek Myths, and it has a very nice rendition of a lot of Greek myths. But I would say go to the library, and if I were you, I would focus on first, try and find stories that somehow you are interested in. So if you have many people in the US have a variety of backgrounds, see if you can find something from your own culture or many cultures that connects to you somehow. And that might get a question for a grandma or grandpa, something that they might be able to fill in a blank that will be even juicier for you.
Very good. And here's a question from Bailey. Since men so often hold narrative control, how can women relate to or tell their own stories through the stars?
Okay, Bailey, let's not mince our words. That's a great question, especially now, but always. Sometimes these stories depict women in a way that's makes them look weak or victims. So I get what you're saying. What I try and do is I try and find stories that empower women as much as possible. Also, given that I've told you there are variations on the theme, I gravitate toward the variation that is most empowering as possible. So going out in the world and looking for stars that tell something positive about the role of women, I think is a very good practice. So you go, girl, go find good stories. And this goes for everyone. Find stories that empower people, that tell an honest, authentic story without putting other people down. Great question. Thank you. Well, I'm so glad that we got to share this time together, finding stories in the sky and our cultures. And next time, we're going to, which is not next week, it's on the 26th of 2 weeks from today, I'm going to have the pleasure of sharing with you my experience in the stratosphere when I had a chance to spend 20 hours on Sophia. I'll tell you about that experience. And at that point, we'll also, I hope, have some time to open the mailbag and look for the many questions that we haven't had a chance yet to answer, given our time limitations. I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, I should point one more thing. If you'd like more stories, we will send you a link to a series of recordings that I've made for many stories around Perseus, Hercules, and Ariadne. You'll have a chance to hear more of these stories if you wish. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to our next and final episode of this series.